Greetings and welcome, class. This is Professor Brown. This is CIS 4670, and we are in week 8 of the class. So, with this class, we're going to be looking at securing the cloud. We're in chapter 6 of your text, and we have several things we're going to look at today, including the cloud access and security brokers, and how different cloud companies use security within their platforms, cloud storage, and security as a service. So there are several things that we're going to look at in the chapter today, including different types of hypervisors, some concepts of VM sprawl, VM escape. These are all security issues that we have to be concerned with cloud. Then we'll get into some cloud storage issues, and we'll look at how we look at on-premise versus hosted versus a mixture of the two called a hybrid service that we will explore. And then there's the virtual desktop experience or virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI, VDE, that a lot of companies out there can do. And this is basically using smart consoles or smart stations instead of having an actual PC at your desk. So on pages 184 and 185 of your text, you're going to notice that you have a lot of terminology in and with cloud this week. So there's a good page and a half. Be sure that you get familiar with all this terminology and nomenclature as we go through today. So, looking at different types of cloud computing services, we're going to look at software as a service, platform services, and infrastructure services. So, software as a service is defined by NIST as software that is in the cloud. It's basically not licensed software that you have on premise. So, a lot of software as a service that you see today are things like Salesforce. Salesforce is a great example of software as a service, which is a CRM, a customer relationship management utility. Then we have platform as a service. Platform as a service basically has some sort of processing back end associated with it. And platforms can be things such as loan servicing platforms. So I worked for a company called Intech, and we had an entire platform service that we used and sold to banks. So they basically could offer things like private student loans, commercial loans, personal loans, car loans, home equity line of credits, and they could all use our platform through our data centers on the back end as linked through their main sites. And then we have infrastructure as a service, which is basically being able to use servers and compute and network and storage services, but you have a reserved platform. So AWS does this, Amazon Web Services does this to a certain degree, but companies like OVH and Rackspace are more leaders in that field where they actually give you hardware for you to use in the cloud. So, let's talk about these different models of private, public, community, and hybrid. So, a private cloud instance is a cloud infrastructure provisioned for exclusive use by a single organization. So, basically, this is where you would have a colo and you would buy your own equipment, put it in that colo, and develop it for your own use. You have everything for that. So, an example of that is we have the use of several compute resources with the Western Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, WRCCDC, that's being hosted at a provider in their data center, and we have an entire rack in that data center where we have everything that we use. Then there's public cloud, as opposed to a private cloud, which you can everybody can have access to, basically. So things like private cloud might be, public cloud might be Dropbox. You can go and sign up for a Dropbox account and get your own storage space, and you can pay for it. You can get it for free. It's publicly available. Then there's community cloud, and community cloud is something more along the lines of what you get at, say here at Cal Poly. You have access to Office 365. You didn't pay for it, or you don't have to pay for it. You get an entire terabyte of storage through OneDrive. So that's a great example of a community cloud that we can all use. And finally, there's a hybrid. So a hybrid cloud is that where we have the delivery model that's going to be infrastructure composed of two or more distinct cloud infrastructures, like private and community, or public and community, things of that nature, where it's going to be unique in and of itself. So a lot of times you see hybrid where you have private, you have your own data center, your own compute resources, your own storage resources, and then you're using another providers like AWS, and you have a connection gateway between the two of them, or a private VPN between the two of them, in order for you to utilize them. So this is all because of virtualization. Virtualization, which came about in the beginning of the 2000s, primarily driven by VMware, is where we leverage hypervisors at the compute layer. And when I say compute layer, basically I'm meaning processor and RAM. And there are two different types of hypervisors. So hypervisor type 1s, also known as bare metal, are independent of the operating system and boot before the OS. A Type 2 hypervisor, also known as a hosted or dependent, they have where your operating system cannot boot until the OS is up and running. And it needs an OS to stay up and running as well. So they have a couple of really good examples of hypervisor type 1 and hypervisor type 2 on page 191 of your text. So on this, we also want to look at containers. And containers are application cells. So containers are the next logical iteration of virtualization. And containers are basically alternates to hypervisors, sometimes referred to as Docker containers. They're a piece of software bundled with everything that you need to run your environment. Self-contained, so that's where they get the name containers. They are an operating system level virtualization method for running multiple isolated systems concurrently. And you have a lot more control all the way down to the kernel level with them. So some of the cloud features that we have to look at with VDI and VDE, again, virtual desktop environment and virtual desktop infrastructure, is, are we going to do it on premise or hosted or in the cloud or shared? And it really comes down to what you're processing, what your users are using, and where the virtual desktop is going to be located. So virtual desktop loaded on-prem, where you have all of your compute resources locally and you're basically accessing it via gigabit Ethernet backbone at your access layer, not a problem. It will run very, very, very quickly. You expand that out and you put that into the cloud and say you're going to use VDI or VDE as a hosted service. This is where you run into problems. If you're not doing a whole lot of processing at the desktop layer, you can get away with a lot of stuff. It depends on the amount of bandwidth that you have to your provider. Is it dedicated? Is it over a VPN? Is it secure? And how much latency is there? So when you start getting into latency and you have delay in your environment, that's when your end users will start to complain and they'll start to have issues, and that's when things get complicated and frustrating. So that's the big thing between on-premise, hosted, and cloud. So there's also some security aspects that we have to take into consideration. VM escape protection. So this is where the possibility exists that a crash in another user or another customer's environment is going to affect you in your environment. This happens in the cloud. And then you have a leak within the hypervisor to where your data is now exposed to that other customer's representatives. We also have to look at sprawl. So virtual machine sprawl, like any other type of sprawl, like urban sprawl, for example, can start small, but typically continues to grow and grow, and before you know it, it gets out of control. And as your systems grow, as your VMs grow, as they require more memory and more storage, it can get rather problematic. You might not have enough compute resources in the form of processor and RAM to support the VMs. You may have the need of additional VMs as your company grows, and then your costs get skewed and out of control. And finally today, we're going to talk a little bit about the security of the cloud. So security is a big deal, obviously. And we have to first look at different types of laws and regulations as they relate to the cloud, because a lot of questions come into play as to, well, if I am hosting all of my VMs in, say, Arizona, but my business is in California, what laws apply to me, California or Arizona? And typically, it's both. So when you have these types of multi-tenancy issues, one of the ways that you can look at it is either limit your use to within your home state, or ensure that you have good legal counsel that can guide you through the pitfalls of any legal issues that may occur. So there's also cloud access, where who has access to the cloud environment? Is it just the system administrators? Is it the users? How do they get access? What passwords are they using, etc.? So cloud access security are actually handled in the same fashion, audited in the same fashion as on-prem security. But different providers have different takes on this. Amazon, for example, can be very flexible in allowing you to have your own access keys provided. They can provide you the keys, or you can use a hybrid solution where you have a key management system that is shared by both. Cloud storage is basically a trend of being able to store data in the cloud at a reasonable rate for a reasonable longevity. And basically you are charged on either how much you put in there, or how much you download from there, or how often it's accessed, or any of the above. It is a little different from provider to provider. So Amazon's S3, for example, is a standard storage service. That's where they get the S3 from. And it's very reliable. It's very durable. You can store an unlimited amount of data in there, and you pay after the first, I don't know, terabyte or so after their free tier. And you also get charged on a basis of how often is that data accessed. Azure has similar type of charges, as does DigitalOcean, as does Google, and on and on and on. And finally, we get into security as a service. So not to be confused with the NIST deployment models of SaaS and PaaS and infrastructure as a service, but security as a service is a subscription-based business model intended to be more cost-effective than having your own staff on site. So managed service providers a lot of times have a security arm that they can provide, and they can you can leverage different types of offerings from them, such as pen testing, compliance audits, vulnerability testing, things of that nature. This is different from managed services where they would patch your systems or do system administration of your systems. This is basically a service to check all that. So here's the difference. You also want to have a separation of duties. You do not want to have your managed service provider be your security service provider. You want to have them a check and balance, if you will. A lot of times these vendors will say, oh, well, we'll give you managed services and we'll also have the security offering as well. Be careful of that, because typically you lose some independence when you do that fashion. So, summing everything up here for this week, we looked at cloud, we looked at different infrastructure regarding cloud, hypervisors. So what you need to know for the test, cloud computing holds a great promise. It offers the ability to decrease cost. That's why it is so attractive, especially by business management. But you also have an increase of risk when you look at going to these solutions. There are service models such as software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And there are different types of delivery models for them: private, public, community, and hybrid. Virtualization is the cornerstone behind cloud, and it's important that you understand the difference between the two types of hypervisors, type 1 and type 2. And finally, we get into some security issues with cloud, such as VM sprawl, VM escape, where the latter also illustrates how new technologies can be very risky, and we have to stay on top of exploits and vulnerabilities. So, for the exam, know the 3 cloud service models, know the 4 different cloud delivery models, know the purposes of a hypervisor, and the hypervisor types and their differences. So that's it for week 8. We'll also need to look at, find the syllabus here. Homework 3 is due this week. Homework 3 was that video from a USC lecture by Malcolm Nance this past summer. Be sure that you look at that and do the write-up and turn it in by this Sunday. So that's it for this week. Be sure you spend time, watch that lecture by Dr. Nance, and I look forward to seeing your write-ups this week. Thanks a lot, and we will see you around. This is Dr. Brown. Have a great week.